On September 21st, 1938, an unrelenting force of nature tore through New England, leaving an indelible mark on the region's history. The Great New England Hurricane, later nicknamed the Long Island Express due to its swift and unexpected arrival, became one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever strike the northeastern United States. In a matter of hours, it claimed the lives of over 600 people, caused injuries to thousands more, and left countless communities utterly unrecognizable. The storm's ferocity was unmatched. It first formed as a tropical wave off the coast of Africa, traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, where warm waters fueled its growth into a formidable hurricane. By the time it reached the southeastern United States, meteorologists had grossly underestimated its trajectory. Believing it would veer out to sea, little warning was given to residents along the northeastern coast. In truth, the hurricane was barreling straight for New England at an alarming speed of nearly 70 miles per hour, faster than any hurricane previously recorded. New England was particularly vulnerable to such an event. At the time, weather forecasting was rudimentary at best. The region lacked the satellite technology and sophisticated warning systems we take for granted today. This left residents unaware of the magnitude of the storm, many continuing their daily routines as disaster approached. Adding to this, the infrastructure was ill-prepared for such an assault. Homes, businesses, and roads were constructed without consideration for hurricane-strength winds or catastrophic flooding. The context in which the storm arrived made its impact even more harrowing. The late 1930s were marked by economic strife. As the Great Depression lingered on, many communities were still reeling from the historic floods of 1936, which had decimated homes and livelihoods across the region. For families struggling to rebuild, the 1938 hurricane was not just a natural disaster, it was an unimaginable blow to their chances of recovery. The storm brought a unique and destructive element rarely seen in the region, a storm surge of unparalleled force. As it made landfall on Long Island and moved northward, it pushed an enormous wall of water into coastal communities. Towns like Westerly, Rhode Island, and New London, Connecticut, were among the first to experience the storm's wrath. The surge obliterated homes, docks, and entire neighborhoods, leaving survivors clinging to rooftops or swept away entirely. This was just the beginning. The storm's devastation would stretch far beyond these first few hours, spreading across New England with unimaginable speed and ferocity. As the Great New England Hurricane made its approach, the region's unpreparedness set the stage for disaster. By mid-morning on September 21, 1938, dark clouds began to gather along the southern New England coastline, and the winds picked up with unnerving speed. Yet few recognized the signs of the impending catastrophe. This was a time before widespread hurricane education. Many residents assumed such storms couldn't reach the northeastern United States with significant force. What followed was a tragedy of staggering proportions. When the storm made landfall on Long Island shortly after noon, it unleashed winds of over 120 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 150 miles per hour. Buildings were torn apart as if made of paper, and trees, some centuries old, were uprooted in seconds. Entire forests were leveled, and the sound of snapping trunks and howling winds created an eerie soundtrack to the devastation. By the time the storm crossed the Long Island Sound and struck southern New England, it had evolved into a once-in-a-lifetime meteorological event. The hurricane's speed compounded its destructive power, giving residents little time to react. In the coastal towns of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, the storm surge surged as high as 17 feet in some areas, inundating homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure. Rivers such as the Connecticut and Merrimack overflowed, spreading the floodwaters far inland. In Providence, Rhode Island, the devastation was particularly severe. Downtown streets became rivers, with floodwaters rising to over 13 feet in some areas. Entire neighborhoods were submerged, and the power grid collapsed, leaving the city in total darkness. Across the state, coastal communities like Narragansett and Westerly bore the brunt of the storm's fury. Stories emerged of residents climbing onto rooftops or clinging to debris to survive. For many, help was simply too far away to arrive in time. Compounding the chaos was the hurricane's unpredictable path. Meteorologists had expected the storm to move out to sea, leading many in northern New England to believe they were safe. Instead, the hurricane made an abrupt turn northward, catching even experienced weather forecasters off guard. This miscalculation allowed false confidence to spread among the population, further delaying evacuation and preparation efforts. As the storm pushed further inland, its reach extended into Vermont, New Hampshire, and parts of Maine, where hurricane-strength winds and heavy rainfall caused rivers to overflow. In Massachusetts, Boston experienced severe flooding and wind damage, though the city was spared the worst of the storm surge. Rural areas, however, were hit hard with barns, silos, and farmhouses destroyed, leaving many families homeless overnight. While the wind and rain were terrifying enough, one of the hurricane's most chilling features was its speed. Moving at an average of 47 miles per hour, it allowed little time for emergency responders or civilians to organize rescue efforts. The storm's ferocity and swiftness left a lasting impression on those who lived through it, a haunting reminder of how unpredictable and deadly nature can be. As the storm's violent core tore through New England, the human toll mounted rapidly. Entire families were caught in the crossfire of relentless winds and rising waters, their lives upended in an instant. Survivors would recount harrowing tales of perseverance in the face of unimaginable odds, stories that revealed both the immense cruelty of the storm and the resilience of those who endured it. In coastal communities, the storm surge proved particularly lethal. In towns like Westerly, Rhode Island, walls of water swept away entire streets, dragging homes, vehicles, and people into the ocean. Families scrambled to higher ground, often taking refuge in attics, only to find themselves trapped as water levels continued to rise. For many, the race to escape became a desperate battle against time. In one chilling account, a man clung to a floating door for hours, battered by debris, until he was eventually rescued by a passing boat. The hurricane's ferocity extended far inland, catching rural residents off guard. In the Connecticut River Valley, farmers faced devastation as barns were flattened, livestock drowned, and crops were obliterated by the torrential rain. Entire communities were left isolated, with roads washed out and bridges destroyed, leaving rescue teams unable to reach those in need. In Vermont and New Hampshire, flash floods turned serene streams into raging torrents, sweeping away anything in their path. The economic toll on New Englanders was catastrophic. Many small business owners lost their livelihoods overnight, with storefronts reduced to rubble or submerged under feet of water. Fishermen, a cornerstone of the region's economy, saw their boats destroyed and harbors rendered unusable. The already fragile economy, still recovering from the Great Depression, was dealt a crushing blow, leaving many families struggling to rebuild without financial resources or government aid. Heroism emerged amid the chaos. In Providence, police officers and firefighters braved the floodwaters to rescue stranded residents, forming human chains to guide people to safety. The U.S. Coast Guard deployed ships and personnel to recover survivors from wreckage-strewn waters, often risking their lives in the process. In smaller communities, neighbors banded together to provide makeshift shelters, share food, and care for the injured. One of the most poignant aspects of the disaster was its impact on children. In New London, Connecticut, a schoolhouse was swept away by the storm surge, trapping students and teachers inside. While many perished, some were saved through daring rescues, leaving behind stories of courage and heartbreak that would be remembered for generations. Parents searched tirelessly for missing children, clinging to hope, despite the overwhelming destruction around them. Even in the face of such devastation, the people of New England displayed remarkable determination. For every account of loss and suffering, there were also stories of survival and solidarity. Families who had lost everything found solace in the kindness of strangers, as communities rallied together to provide food, clothing, and shelter. The storm, while leaving a trail of destruction, also revealed the strength of human connection in times of crisis. As the storm subsided, the true scale of the disaster became evident. The devastation that the 1938 hurricane left in its wake reshaped New England, affecting not only the physical landscape, but also the region's collective psyche. The once familiar towns and cities were now ghostly remnants, their landscapes marred by the ruins of buildings, downed trees, and miles of debris-laden streets. Emergency response teams, local authorities, and volunteers scrambled to provide aid, but the task was daunting. The challenge was not just clearing roads or salvaging belongings, it was piecing together shattered lives. One of the most pressing concerns in the days after the hurricane was ensuring the safety and well-being of survivors. Makeshift shelters sprang up in schools, community centers, and churches. Medical personnel worked tirelessly to treat injuries, ranging from broken bones and deep lacerations to illnesses stemming from contaminated water. The disaster left thousands without homes, forcing many to take refuge in temporary housing while rebuilding efforts began in earnest. Communities, which had been torn apart, began to come together with an incredible display of unity, determined to rebuild their homes and lives. The financial costs of the hurricane were staggering. In the immediate aftermath, estimates put the total damage at around $400 million, a figure equivalent to several billion dollars today. The storm's economic impact was not limited to property damage. It was felt throughout New England's industries. Fishing, shipping, and trade were particularly hard hit, contributing to the already dire economic climate of the Great Depression. The storm underscored the vulnerability of the region's infrastructure and brought attention to the urgent need for improvements to withstand future catastrophes. This catastrophe ultimately spurred significant changes in how the United States approached weather forecasting and disaster preparedness. The Great New England Hurricane was a wake-up call that underscored the limitations of meteorological technology of the time. Before this event, weather forecasting was rudimentary at best, with limited tools and data for tracking storms. The 1938 hurricane led to advancements in this field, laying the groundwork for modern forecasting. While the storm had taken the country by surprise, it served as a catalyst for improvements such as the establishment of the National Weather Service, which would eventually employ more sophisticated radar systems and computer models to predict the path and intensity of hurricanes with greater accuracy. Infrastructure development was also a significant outcome of the hurricane's aftermath. Coastal areas that had once been vulnerable to the forces of nature saw the construction of seawalls, stronger flood barriers, and improved building codes. These measures were intended to protect both human lives and property from future disasters. The storm left New England with a lasting legacy of resilience, a reminder that in the face of nature's immense power, preparation and unity are the keys to survival. The memory of the 1938 hurricane continues to hold a place in New England's collective consciousness. Annual hurricane preparedness drills, community education, and awareness campaigns have all been influenced by the lessons learned from that fateful September day. Families who lived through it passed down stories of survival and loss, ensuring that the impact of the storm was never forgotten. For generations, the event has been seen as both a tragedy and a triumph of human spirit, a chapter in the history of the region that speaks to the importance of respect for the forces of nature, community solidarity, and the never-ending work of rebuilding and fortifying in the wake of disaster. As we reflect on the legacy of the Great New England Hurricane, it becomes clear that while nature can be merciless, the courage and resilience of those who face such challenges can be inspiring. The storm's wrath might have left deep scars, but the response to it paved the way for a safer, more prepared future. And so this storm is not just a story of loss, it is also a testament to the strength of the people who lived through it and the lessons learned that continue to shape how we prepare for the unexpected. The early hours of July 28, 1976 seem no different from any other summer morning in Tangshan, a growing industrial city in northeastern China. Positioned in Hebei province, Tangshan was home to approximately 1 million people, many of whom were miners, factory workers, and their families. Life hummed along with an air of routine. Few could have imagined that this ordinary day would soon become etched in history as the setting for one of the deadliest earthquakes of the 20th century. At precisely 3:42 a.m., an earthquake struck with a magnitude of 7.5 on the Richter scale. Its epicenter was located just 12 kilometers beneath the surface, a shallow depth that would amplify its destructive power. The region's geological makeup played a critical role in the disaster. Tangshan was situated on loose sedimentary soil, which exacerbated the seismic waves as they radiated outward. These amplified tremors turned the earth beneath the city into a rolling, heaving force of devastation. Adding to the catastrophe, Tangshan's urban development was not prepared for such a seismic event. The city lacked earthquake-resistant infrastructure, and many of its buildings were constructed from unreinforced masonry and other substandard materials. This left them vulnerable to collapse under the earthquake's immense force. When the quake struck, entire city blocks were razed in seconds, leaving little standing in its wake. The immediate aftermath was horrifying. Entire families were buried beneath rubble as buildings crumbled like sandcastles. Streets buckled, bridges snapped, and water mains ruptured, flooding parts of the city and making rescue efforts even more challenging. The ground itself became a hazard as fissures opened up, swallowing anything or anyone in their path. Communication lines were severed, isolating Tangshan from the outside world and delaying the flow of critical information about the scale of the disaster. The timing of the earthquake added to the tragedy. Striking while most residents were asleep in their homes, The death toll skyrocketed as people were caught completely off guard. Survivors later recounted how they were jolted awake by violent shaking, only to be engulfed by collapsing walls and falling debris. Darkness, chaos, and confusion overwhelmed the city as cries for help echoed into the night. Despite its seismic significance, there were no foreshocks to serve as a warning. While some animals reportedly exhibited unusual behavior in the hours before the quake, such as dogs barking incessantly and livestock acting erratically, these signs were not enough to prompt human action. This absence of clear warning further underscores the unexpected nature of the disaster. In the hours following the quake, Tangshan's true plight remained hidden from the world. Limited communication and China's tightly controlled media meant that the full scale of the disaster would not emerge immediately. For now, Tangshan's residents were left to grapple with the immense destruction and loss, unaided and largely unnoticed by the outside world. This marked the beginning of a disaster whose ripple effects would extend far beyond its epicenter, reshaping disaster response, preparedness, and urban planning in China and beyond. As the clock struck 3:42 in the early hours of late July, the peaceful city of Tangshan, still shrouded in the stillness of night, was torn apart by a seismic upheaval unlike anything its residents had experienced. The earthquake's force was swift, brutal, and uncompromising, generating seismic waves that spread destruction across a staggering area of over 3,000 square kilometers. The ground heaved violently, transforming solid earth into a liquid-like phenomenon known as soil liquefaction, a catastrophic process that caused buildings to tilt, sink, or collapse entirely. While the epicenter was located within Tangshan, the earthquake's effects radiated far beyond the city. Surrounding towns and rural areas were hit hard, with entire communities flattened in mere seconds. Structures ranging from modest village homes to industrial facilities crumbled under their relentless vibrations. The region's coal mines, a vital part of Tangshan's economy, were particularly devastated, trapping hundreds of workers underground. For those miners, survival became a race against time as tunnels caved in, cutting off both air and escape routes. The damage extended to critical infrastructure, further compounding the chaos. Railways were twisted into grotesque shapes, severing vital transportation links. Power plants were rendered inoperable, plunging the area into darkness, while water pipelines shattered, leaving survivors without clean water. Bridges that once connected the city to nearby regions were reduced to piles of twisted steel and concrete, isolating Tangshan further from external aid. One of the earthquake's most haunting aspects was its sheer speed. Experts later estimated that the most intense shaking lasted less than 15 seconds, yet the destruction it wrought was monumental. This brevity meant that those who might have reacted to the tremors had virtually no time to escape. Survivors described the moments of impact as akin to an apocalyptic storm, walls collapsing, roofs caving in, and the air filling with a deafening roar as the ground moved beneath them. Adding to the horror, the earthquake struck during a heat wave, compounding the physical and emotional toll on survivors. Temperatures soared, and without shelter, clean water, or medical supplies, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Many were forced to endure the blistering heat while searching for loved ones or trying to rescue neighbors trapped beneath the rubble. The sweltering conditions also accelerated the decomposition of bodies, posing significant health risks and further traumatizing those who remained. Another tragic element of the disaster was the widespread loss of life among children. Many schools in Tangshan were not built to withstand even minor earthquakes, let alone a seismic event of this magnitude. As a result, countless young lives were lost when classrooms collapsed, burying students and teachers under tons of debris. These heart-wrenching scenes left an indelible scar on the community and would later fuel demands for stricter building regulations and earthquake preparedness. Meanwhile, survivors faced a terrifying landscape of ruin. Fires broke out across the city as ruptured gas lines ignited, creating an additional hazard for those navigating the wreckage. The air became thick with smoke, dust, and the cries of those in pain or mourning their losses. Every moment was a test of resilience as individuals banded together to lift debris, carry the injured to makeshift medical stations, or dig with their bare hands in desperate attempts to find loved ones. Despite the enormity of the disaster, Tangshan's plight initially remained largely unknown to the outside world. The destruction of communication lines and the isolated nature of the region created a chilling silence that left even neighboring cities unaware of the unfolding tragedy. For the people of Tangshan, this isolation deepened their sense of abandonment, as it became clear that immediate help was not on the way. These early hours marked a critical juncture in what would become one of history's most significant natural disasters, setting the stage for an unparalleled story of survival, loss, and resilience. The devastation caused by the Tangshan earthquake unfolded on an almost unimaginable scale. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, creating a vast expanse of destruction where homes, schools, factories, and hospitals once stood. Over 90% of the city's buildings were either damaged or completely destroyed, leaving the majority of Tangshan's population without shelter. The widespread collapse of infrastructure compounded the chaos, forcing survivors to confront a harsh and unforgiving reality in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. The industrial heart of Tangshan, once a bustling hub of economic activity, was obliterated. Factories that powered the region's economy lay in ruins, and heavy machinery was scattered like toys across the landscape. Among the hardest hit were coal mines, which suffered catastrophic collapses, burying hundreds of workers deep underground. These miners faced a desperate battle for survival, contending with toxic gas, flooding, and the ever-present risk of further cave-ins. Hospitals and medical facilities critical for treating the injured were not spared. Most were destroyed, and those that remained operational were overwhelmed within hours. Makeshift medical centers sprang up in open fields and among the debris, staffed by a few doctors and nurses who survived. Supplies of antibiotics, painkillers, and bandages were woefully inadequate, forcing medical workers to improvise treatments and prioritize the most critical cases. With the injured numbering in the tens of thousands, triage became a grim and inescapable task. Amidst the destruction, survivors faced immense challenges in securing basic necessities. Access to clean water was nearly non-existent, as pipelines had been shattered and wells contaminated. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, leaving many to scavenge through the wreckage or share meager rations. The summer heat exacerbated these hardships, with temperatures soaring above 37 degrees Celsius, further threatening the health of those already weakened by injury or exhaustion. Survivors banded together in an incredible display of human resilience and solidarity. Men, women, and even children took part in rescue efforts, using bare hands and simple tools to dig through the rubble. Makeshift teams formed spontaneously, driven by the shared hope of finding loved ones alive beneath the debris. Tragically, the majority of those trapped could not be saved, as the sheer scale of destruction and the lack of heavy rescue equipment hindered these efforts. The earthquake also inflicted devastating emotional wounds. Families were torn apart as countless lives were lost in an instant. The grief of those who survived was compounded by the uncertainty surrounding the fate of their loved ones. Makeshift memorials began appearing within days, with survivors placing flowers, candles, and personal mementos near the sites where friends and family had perished. Adding to the catastrophe, aftershocks continued to terrorize the region. These tremors, some significant in their own right, caused further collapses and heightened the fear of those already traumatized by the initial quake. For the residents of Tangshan, the ground beneath them seemed permanently unstable, and each aftershock was a cruel reminder of their vulnerability. As word of the disaster began to spread beyond Tangshan, nearby towns and villages grappled with their own losses. The destruction was not confined to the city alone. Smaller communities were equally devastated, though their struggles often went unnoticed in the shadow of Tangshan's catastrophe. These areas faced similar shortages of water, food, and medical supplies, further straining the limited resources available for relief efforts. In these early days, survival was a test of willpower and ingenuity. The residents of Tangshan and its surrounding areas displayed extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, setting the stage for a long and arduous recovery. The city's ruins bore silent witness to the resilience of its people, even as the true scope of the disaster was only beginning to emerge. In the months and years following the Tangshan earthquake, the true extent of the disaster became a defining moment in modern Chinese history. The challenges of rebuilding a shattered city, addressing the emotional scars of survivors, and honoring the memory of those lost created a legacy that would shape Tangshan and its people for generations. The Chinese government launched an unprecedented reconstruction effort. Within days of the disaster, engineers and construction crews from across the country descended on Tangshan. Entire neighborhoods were cleared of debris, and temporary shelters were erected to house the displaced population. Despite limited resources, the reconstruction process reflected a commitment to rebuilding not just the city's infrastructure, but its spirit. By the early 1980s, Tangshan began to transform into a symbol of resilience and recovery, with new buildings rising in place of the ruins. Public health initiatives also became a cornerstone of the post-disaster response. The widespread destruction of hospitals and sanitation facilities had led to fears of disease outbreaks. Medical teams worked tirelessly to vaccinate survivors and improve living conditions in temporary camps. Over time, Tangshan emerged as a model for public health planning in the aftermath of disasters, influencing emergency response strategies across China. For the survivors, the earthquake left deep psychological wounds. Many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of the disaster. Community support networks played a crucial role in helping individuals process their grief. Over the years, storytelling, art, and cultural events became powerful tools for healing, allowing survivors to share their experiences and honor the memories of loved ones. The Tangshan earthquake also catalyzed advancements in earthquake research and preparedness. The scale of destruction highlighted the need for improved building standards and stricter enforcement of construction codes. By the 1990s, Tangshan's new structures were built to withstand earthquakes, reflecting lessons learned from the tragedy. The disaster also spurred the development of early warning systems and a nationwide focus on earthquake education, which have since saved countless lives. Globally, the Tangshan earthquake drew attention to the importance of international solidarity in the face of natural disasters. Although China largely relied on internal resources, offers of aid from other countries marked a significant shift in global disaster response dynamics. The tragedy underscored the shared vulnerability of humanity and the need for collective action to mitigate the impact of such events. In Tangshan today, memorials stand as a testament to the lives lost and the resilience of those who survived. The Tangshan Earthquake Memorial Park, completed in the late 20th century, is a place of reflection and remembrance. Its design incorporates remnants of destroyed buildings and poignant sculptures, ensuring that the memory of the disaster remains alive for future generations. The earthquake also left an indelible mark on Chinese culture. It inspired literature, film, and academic studies, shaping the way disasters are understood and discussed. The stories of survival and courage from Tangshan resonate far beyond the city, serving as a reminder of humanity's strength in the face of unimaginable loss. As the decades have passed, Tangshan has risen from its darkest moment to become a thriving city once again. Its recovery is a testament to the resilience of its people, the power of community, and the lessons learned from one of history's most devastating natural disasters. The legacy of the Tangshan earthquake is not merely one of destruction, but also of rebuilding, healing, and hope for a better future. The Black Saturday bushfires, which ravaged the Australian state of Victoria on February 7, 2009, stand as one of the most devastating natural disasters in Australian history. It wasn't just a single fire, but rather a collection of more than 400 individual fires that sparked across the state, burning millions of acres of land. What made this disaster so catastrophic was the perfect storm of extreme weather conditions, combined with the years of drought and dry vegetation, which set the stage for an event of unimaginable destruction. On the day of the fires, the temperatures soared to record-breaking heights. In many areas, the mercury climbed to over 46 degrees Celsius, or 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Such extreme heat was coupled with hot, dry winds reaching speeds of up to 120 kilometers per hour or 75 miles per hour. These conditions, combined with a prolonged drought that had left the land parched, created a recipe for disaster. The land was so dry that even the smallest spark could ignite a massive fire. The fires that started on Black Saturday quickly grew out of control, fueled by these extreme weather conditions. The dry forests, grasslands, and bush areas provided an abundance of flammable material that allowed the flames to spread with incredible speed. As a result, many of these fires became megafires, fires that were far too large and powerful for conventional firefighting methods to control. The challenge for the firefighters was immense. While Victoria has a well-established firefighting force, the scale and intensity of the fires on that day were unprecedented. The fires spread across both remote and populated areas, making it difficult for emergency services to keep up. In some cases, they had no choice but to retreat as the flames advanced faster than they could respond. The fires had a terrifying ability to change direction with the wind, creating unpredictable and dangerous conditions for those trying to fight them. Despite the efforts of thousands of firefighters, many towns were engulfed in the flames. The speed with which the fires spread meant that many people had little to no time to evacuate. As night fell, the fires continued to rage, leaving communities devastated. In total, the fires claimed the lives of 173 people, many of whom were trapped by the flames or unable to escape in time. Hundreds of others were injured and thousands of homes were destroyed, leaving countless families without shelter. The intense heat also made the fires exceptionally dangerous. In addition to the flames themselves, the fires generated massive amounts of heat and smoke, creating a deadly combination of air pollution and unbearable temperatures. In some areas, the heat was so extreme that it could melt the metal of vehicles, and the smoke was thick enough to make it nearly impossible to breathe. This catastrophic event didn't just affect those in the path of the flames. The air pollution from the fires was widespread, impacting communities far from the fire zones. Smoke traveled hundreds of kilometers, blanketing cities like Melbourne, turning the sky an eerie orange, and causing respiratory issues for residents. The impact was felt by the entire state, and even beyond, with the fires leaving a profound mark on Australia's history. The Black Saturday bushfires were a tragedy that left scars on the landscape and the people who lived through them. As we move forward in this series, we'll delve deeper into how the fires unfolded, the heroic efforts of the firefighters, and the long road to recovery that followed in the aftermath. But for now, it's important to understand that the conditions leading up to Black Saturday set the stage for one of the most destructive and unforgettable days in Australian history. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the events that unfolded on Black Saturday and the aftermath that reshaped communities and lives forever. As the sun rose on February 7, 2009, the sky over Victoria was an ominous shade of red, hinting at the disaster that was about to unfold. The weather was already reaching extreme levels by early morning, with temperatures rising quickly and the winds picking up speed. By midday, it was clear that this would not be an ordinary fire season. The fire warnings issued by emergency services were upgraded to catastrophic levels in many parts of the state, meaning that conditions were so extreme that fire could not be controlled once it started. The fires began to spread rapidly, their reach extending into the vast and dry bushland of Victoria. At first, it seemed like it might just be another bad fire season, but by the afternoon, it was clear this was something far worse. The fires were relentless, with some burning so hot that they created their own weather systems. The intensity of the flames generated powerful updrafts, pulling in more oxygen, which further fueled the fires and made them burn even hotter. In some places, the firestorms generated winds of up to 120 kilometers per hour, making it almost impossible for firefighters to get close. The flames didn't just spread on the ground, they were carried by the winds across long distances. Spot fires, which occur when embers are carried by the wind to start fires far from the original blaze, were a major issue. These spot fires began popping up in areas that hadn't been touched by the initial flames, further complicating efforts to contain the fires. For many, the fire seemed to come out of nowhere, catching them off guard in a way that few had ever experienced. As the fires spread uncontrollably, towns and rural communities in their path found themselves in immediate danger. Some towns, like King Lake and Marysville, would never be the same again. The winds were so powerful that they carried burning embers and sparks miles away from the flames, igniting new areas and stretching the fire's reach. The local fire brigades, who had been trained for such emergencies, were overwhelmed, and emergency services scrambled to organize evacuation efforts. One of the biggest challenges faced during the early hours of the bushfires was the lack of communication and coordination. The scale of the fire was so vast that emergency services had difficulty tracking the fire's progress and determining where it would strike next. The fires were spreading unpredictably, making it nearly impossible to evacuate people ahead of time. In some instances, residents were advised to stay in their homes and defend them. But the speed at which the fires spread meant that even those precautions weren't enough to save them. The extreme heat was a significant factor in the devastation. As the fire spread, it ignited trees, homes, and vehicles alike. The temperature near the flames was so high that metal objects melted and concrete cracked. Many people had no choice but to flee into the dense smoke and heat, hoping to reach safety, while others stayed behind, trying to save their homes, only to be overtaken by the flames. One of the most harrowing elements of that day was how quickly people were forced to make life or death decisions. The danger was so immediate that evacuation routes became blocked, and roads became impassable due to the fires. Entire families were separated, with some members trapped in homes or caught in the chaos while others managed to escape. In these moments, the fires proved just how fast disaster could strike, and how unprepared many were for the sheer scale of destruction that was unfolding. As the day wore on, the fires continued to rage, and emergency services were stretched to their limits. Despite the overwhelming challenges, firefighters and emergency responders continued to risk their lives in an attempt to save others. Many crews were unable to reach some of the more isolated towns, and some found themselves battling the flames just to survive, as the fires turned into walls of heat and smoke. At this point, it was clear that this would not be a fight that could be won in a single day. The Black Saturday bushfires were now in full swing, and their consequences would echo for years to come. Stay tuned as we explore the devastation of these fires in greater detail and the human stories of survival, loss, and resilience in the face of tragedy. By the evening of February 7th, 2009, the fires had become a full-blown catastrophe. Entire communities were in the direct path of the flames, with some towns completely wiped off the map. The impact of these fires was unlike anything seen before in Australia. As the fires continued to rage, many people found themselves in the fight for their lives. They were not only battling the relentless inferno, but also the suffocating heat and thick, toxic smoke that made it almost impossible to breathe. One of the most severe impacts was on the town of Marysville, located just outside the Yarra Ranges National Park. This community, home to around 500 people, was decimated. The fires roared through with such intensity that the town was practically obliterated. Buildings were reduced to ash, and the iconic landmarks which once made the town a popular destination were gone. In just a few hours, Marysville was transformed from a vibrant town into a ghost town with only a handful of structures left standing. Some residents were fortunate enough to escape the flames, but many others weren't as lucky. Tragically, 47 people lost their lives in the Marysville area alone. For those who survived the fires, the immediate aftermath was a nightmare. Roads had been blocked and many of the evacuation routes were impassable. Residents were forced to seek shelter wherever they could find it. King Lake, another community hard hit by the fires, saw residents flee into nearby forests and local buildings in a desperate bid for safety. In an act of incredible bravery, a group of people took shelter in the local pub, hoping it would provide enough protection from the flames. The temperature outside was so intense that it felt like the air itself was burning, and the heat inside the pub was almost unbearable. But somehow, despite the suffocating conditions, the group survived the inferno that engulfed much of the surrounding area. While many found refuge in these makeshift shelters, others were not as fortunate. The fires moved so quickly that some people found themselves trapped in their homes, unable to escape as the walls of fire drew closer. Many of these individuals were forced to make the unimaginable decision to either attempt to flee into the flames or wait it out, hoping the fire would pass them by. For some, the danger was so great that they had to dive into pools or nearby bodies of water to survive, while others huddled together in their homes hoping for a miracle. In the midst of all this chaos, the efforts of emergency services became even more crucial. Firefighters were working around the clock, but they were overwhelmed by the scale of the fires. The fire's unpredictability made it difficult for fire crews to get ahead of the destruction. They were constantly on the move, trying to protect homes and evacuate people, but their progress was often slowed by the thick smoke and rapidly changing fire fronts. In some cases, firefighters had to retreat to avoid being trapped by the flames themselves. Despite the overwhelming challenges, they persevered, even when faced with near impossible odds. At the same time, the devastation was not just limited to the loss of homes. The impact on the natural environment was catastrophic. Victoria's bushland, home to many native species of animals and plants, was decimated by the fires. Habitats that had taken centuries to develop were wiped out in a matter of hours. For example, areas that once supported koala populations were turned to ash, and countless other species were left without homes. The environmental toll of the fires would continue to be felt long after the flames were extinguished. As the fires began to subside, the true scale of the devastation became clear. It wasn't just the physical destruction that was heartbreaking, but also the psychological scars that would remain for those affected. Families who had lost everything were now faced with the daunting task of rebuilding their lives from the ground up. The fires had not only taken their homes, but also their sense of security. The psychological impact of such an event can be overwhelming, and it would take years for many survivors to fully recover. But even in the face of this incredible devastation, there were stories of resilience. Communities, despite being broken, found ways to come together. Volunteers flooded into the affected areas, offering their help, support, and resources. The kindness and generosity shown by strangers in the aftermath of the fires were overwhelming. Donations of food, clothing, and other supplies poured in from all corners of the country. People from across Australia banded together to support the survivors, and the spirit of unity was one of the most powerful outcomes from such a tragic event. As we reflect on the heartbreaking devastation caused by the Black Saturday bushfires, we remember not just the destruction, but also the strength and resilience of the individuals and communities who survived. In the face of overwhelming loss, they found ways to rebuild, to recover, and to honor the memory of those they lost. The physical damage was staggering, but the emotional and psychological toll was equally profound. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the response from emergency services, the bravery shown by so many, and how the survivors began to pick up the pieces of their lives. Stay tuned. As the flames from the Black Saturday bushfires finally began to subside, the immense task of rebuilding and recovery took center stage. The scale of the destruction was so great that it required a coordinated response from all levels of government, emergency services, and the public. The fires had left thousands of families without homes, entire communities in ruins, and many victims struggling with the emotional scars left behind by the devastating experience. The immediate priority was to provide relief to those who had been affected. In the days following the fires, emergency teams worked tirelessly to deliver food, water, and shelter to the survivors. Temporary shelters were set up, and displaced residents were given a place to stay while they began to process the extent of the damage. Volunteers flooded into the affected areas, offering their time and resources to help with the cleanup and support efforts. The response was nothing short of extraordinary, with communities coming together in the face of overwhelming tragedy. However, while the immediate response focused on providing relief, the longer-term recovery process was just as critical. Rebuilding homes and infrastructure was a monumental challenge, particularly in areas where entire towns had been reduced to rubble. In many places, families found themselves living in temporary accommodation for months, even years, as they awaited the construction of new homes. The emotional toll of losing everything and the difficulty of starting over weighed heavily on many survivors. One of the key aspects of the recovery process was the psychological support provided to those affected. The trauma of surviving such a catastrophic event left many with deep emotional scars. Counseling services were made available to help people deal with grief, loss, and post-traumatic stress. The psychological impact of the fires was a critical issue that had to be addressed for the well-being of the survivors. Mental health professionals worked tirelessly to offer support, but it was clear that the recovery would take time. The Black Saturday bushfires also had a lasting impact on Australia's approach to bushfire management. The sheer scale of the fires exposed weaknesses in the country's fire preparedness and response systems. In the wake of the tragedy, there was a widespread push for reform, with many calling for better coordination between emergency services and more effective public education on fire safety. It was evident that the response to future bushfire crises would need to be better organized and more efficient. A major reform that followed was the introduction of the Fire Ready program, which aimed to better inform the public about fire risks and the actions they could take to protect themselves. One of the biggest lessons learned was the importance of early warning systems and better communication between authorities and communities. In addition, the role of fire refuges, or designated safe zones for residents to seek shelter during fires, became a key area of focus. These changes were designed to ensure that the devastating loss of life experienced during the Black Saturday bushfires would not be repeated in future fires. Environmental recovery was another long-term challenge. Many areas that had been devastated by the fires had once been home to Australia's most unique and endangered wildlife. The destruction of habitats was a tragic blow to the country's rich biodiversity. Efforts to restore these environments included planting native vegetation and creating wildlife corridors to help animals return to their homes. Wildlife recovery programs also provided care and rehabilitation for injured animals, ensuring that some species could begin to recover from the damage caused by the fires. Another significant focus of the recovery was the restoration of infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and other essential structures had been destroyed or damaged by the fires, leaving many communities isolated. The rebuilding efforts required a vast amount of resources and coordination, with both government agencies and local communities working together to restore access to vital services. Beyond the physical rebuilding, the Black Saturday bushfires also left an indelible mark on the cultural fabric of Victoria. Communities that had been devastated by the fires began to rebuild not just their homes, but also their lives. For many, the fires brought an overwhelming sense of loss, but they also fostered a renewed sense of community and solidarity. Neighbors helped each other, strangers became friends, and entire towns began to come together again. The recovery process, while long and difficult, ultimately showcased the incredible resilience of the people of Victoria. While the fires of February 7th, 2009 will never be forgotten, the Black Saturday bushfires also provided important lessons for future generations. The events of that day highlighted the power of nature, but they also illuminated the strength and resilience of the human spirit. The response from the Australian people was a testament to their ability to come together in the face of overwhelming adversity. As we reflect on the legacy of the Black Saturday bushfires, it's clear that while the pain of that day will never fully fade, the recovery process continues to inspire hope. The lessons learned from the fires have led to better fire management strategies, a more informed public, and a more resilient community. The survivors of the fires, though forever changed, have shown the world the strength of the human spirit and the power of community in overcoming even the most unimaginable challenges. Let us remember the victims, the survivors, the heroes, and the lessons learned from this tragic event. The Black Saturday bushfires may have devastated communities, but they also sparked a sense of unity and resilience that continues to shape Australia today.